Everyone agrees that we have a crisis with America's defense industrial base. There isn't enough of one, and the hour, it seems, may be getting late. The problem is particularly acute in the realm of shipbuilding. What does it take to build a warship in America in 2025? And what needs to be done to fill the alarming gaps that exist? Let's get into it.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
We continue to face a grave situation in Iran.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
For more, follow School of War on YouTube, Instagram, Substack, and Twitter. And feel free to follow me on Twitter at Aaron B. McLean. Hi, I'm Aaron McLean. Thanks for joining School of War. I am delighted to welcome to the show today two very distinguished guests, Eric Chewning and Thomas Moore. Eric is Executive Vice President of Strategy and Development for HII. Thomas Moore is Corporate Vice President of Customer Affairs there. He's also a 39 veteran of the United States Navy, or a Vice Admiral there. Eric was Chief of Staff to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. He was in the Army, done a lot of other things. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining the show.
Great. Well, hey, Aaron, thanks for having us on. I'm a real big fan of the podcast, and it's a treat to be on with you and my friend Tom Moore, particularly since we're going to discuss what it takes to make American shipbuilding great again.
That's our subject for today. Tom, you spent a lot of time on board ships. Tell us a bit about your career, the kind of commands you had, the kind of experiences you had, and how that gives you insight to the kind of work you do today.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for the question. I started as a nuclear trained officer, interviewed with Hunter Rickover back in fall of 1980.
Wow.
That's some great stories there. Spent the first 13 years of my career on nuclear cruisers, nuclear aircraft carriers. We actually had nuclear-powered cruisers back then in those days. And lateral transferred over what's called the engineering duty community. I went to MIT, got a degree in nuclear engineering, and then spent really the next 25 years doing ship acquisition, ship design, and principally in the aircraft carrier world for most of it. And the last 4 years was the head of the Naval Sea Systems Command, which owns ship design, ship construction, lifecycle management of all the Navy's ships, submarines, and combat systems.
Since you raised it, I have to ask you about your Rickover interview. I taught at Navy for a few happy years. There was a Rickover Hall.
Yeah.
I assume there wasn't one in the time we're talking about.
No, Rickover. I'm not that old. We had a Rickover Hall as the engineering hall back then. It's in fact it's a little dilapidated right now. We probably need to update it a little bit. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting day. He was an interesting and figure, and you know, if you think about as we get into shipbuilding and talk about shipbuilding today, you know, from design concept to delivering the Nautilus, it was 6 years. So from the time he thought about building a nuclear-powered submarine to actually putting and operating a nuclear-powered submarine back then. So really to kind of set the bar for a lot of what we should be thinking about today as we need to accelerate shipbuilding. But yeah, the interview was, he spent most of the day with his staff doing technical interviews, asking you things like derive the area circle, things of that nature. And then they put you in an outer office and you wait, and then his inner office and you wait, and then eventually his secretary comes and gets you, and you go in for this interview. And before they have a handler that goes in with you, some Navy commander at the time who's supposed to be there to help you, but basically he's there to just make sure that any commitments that you made to the admiral they write down. So when you come back 5 years later, they can see if you kept your promises. And so, you know, I went in. My interview was very short. In hindsight, I would wish it had been longer, but I was so terrified that I was happy to get out of there. He just asked me 3 questions: why do you want to be in my program? Are you getting married? And do you study enough? And then he said, "That's all." And when he said "that's all," it was like the Wizard of Oz and the lion just coming out of the hall. And I bolted for the cover.
Because these are famous, aren't they, for sort of unconventional questions and kind of off the wall stuff? It sounds like you must have met him in a soft moment or something like that.
Yeah, it was the end of the day. You know, you go in. At the time he was 82. He's got this massive desk, this massive oak chair, and he was in this gray suit, kind of a shriveled up 82-year-old man, and he put you in this chair that they had sawed off the front of the legs, and she kind of leaning forward. And I just remember sitting down and looking up at him, and my first reaction was almost to, I was almost laugh because he was so small, and he's just shuffling paperwork around, and the next thing you know, he starts, firing those 3 questions. But yeah, I got off easy. I had a good friend of mine, roommate of mine, didn't answer one of the questions right, got sent into one of the broom closets to sit and think about what he had said wrong for a couple hours before he got called back in for his interview. So you can read some of the books about Rickover, but he was famous for, if somebody called in that was a senior officer, handing the phone to some midshipman and saying, "You know a lot about leadership. Why don't you tell this admiral what leadership's all about?" and put you on the spot. But to your point, he just was really interested in seeing how you were going to think on your feet.
Yeah.
And that was really kind of the hallmark of his program. He could train you well, and he wanted decisions to be made at the lowest possible level and people that were willing to make decisions. And that's what he wanted to challenge and see if you could do that.
Eric, tell us a bit about your time in Iraq, and then, as your career extended, you started to work on these industrial-based questions while you were at the Pentagon. So just tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, no, so I guess I entered this ecosystem a bit differently than Tom. So I started off as an investment banker. So I was doing M&A and corporate finance at Morgan Stanley, and then September 11th happened, and then I enlisted in the Army. So enlisted in the Army, went to officer candidate school, was commissioned, ended up serving with the 1st Cavalry Division out of Fort Hood, was deployed to Iraq for all of 2004, first part of 2005 as the intelligence officer for the unit. And it was a remarkable time to be in Iraq. It was just the tail end of OEF-1, kind of startup to OEF-2. And you could begin to really feel the Army beginning to transition itself from that initial high-intensity fight to what the counterinsurgency was going to expand and evolve into. And so I had a very innovative battalion commander that gave me a lot of freedom to kind of set up what we were doing in the area. And we were in the northwest quadrant of Baghdad in the Khaniyah district. And we actually used that to pioneer a lot of concepts, really relearning how to do counterinsurgency that we then codified, myself and our battalion S3 later, for an article in Military Review that then became kind of the basis around which was used for the surge planning in 2007.
Got it. So when you were at the Pentagon, I think it was 2018, you did a review of the defense industrial base.
Yep.
I think there's more conversation about it now in the public sphere perhaps than there was then. What did you discover when you looked under the hood?
Yeah.
The DIB.
So it's interesting, right? So just to maybe fill in the 11-year gap. So when I got out of the Army, went to business school, and then after business school went into management consulting, was a partner at McKinsey, and then got asked to join the Trump administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Policy. And one of the first things I did was partner with the White House. Peter Navarro at the time was running his Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. And the Trump administration's instincts initially were, we're going to have to do a lot to address the decline in U.S. manufacturing that occurred over the past 20 years. And we can talk a bit about the policy choices that were made to deindustrialize the country. But there was an instinctive recognition that we needed to reindustrialize America, and that a way to do that was to focus on the impact it would have on the defense industrial base. So I led that review. It was the largest review of the defense industrial base since the Eisenhower administration. And the thing that I found was so surprising was we did not have a strong sense for what was going on in the sub-tier of our industrial base, right? So everyone thinks about the large primes, and there's a very clear path between the department and management of large defense primes. But once you get into the tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 of the defense industrial base, the fragility of that defense industrial base, how tied in it was with the broader U.S. manufacturing economy, and as U.S. manufacturing eroded, how that erosion caused weakness and fragility in a lot of sole source supply relationships, and then increasingly how Chinese state-sponsored activity was effectively incorporating itself in very important and very nefarious ways into the sub-tier of our industrial base, right? And that you could see Chinese policy, whether it was through their Chinese made in 2025 or civil military fusion programs, as really trying to go in and see where they could develop dependencies within our system on China. So one of the things I had the opportunity to do as we got that 13806 report finished was then begin to work on policy actions to address some of these things. One of the primary ones we drove was FIRMA, which is the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, which was an update to CFIUS. Because at the time, we recognized that Chinese policy was we're going to go and buy U.S. companies, and then we're going to use that as what we call it sort of investment-driven technology transfer, and that the CFIUS legislation at the time wasn't strong enough to stop that. So we got CFIUS modernized. We worked to expand the Defense Production Act, the authorities of the Defense Production Act, so we could begin to use that in a meaningful way to begin to address some of these single points of failure, like rare earth processing is one that folks talk a lot about, but there are hundreds of others that systematically we have to go and try and address. And I think so often, like it is in the Pentagon, once you're in a job and you really feel your momentum underneath you, you're put into a new job. And so that's when I got pulled up in 2019 to be the chief of staff initially for Pat Shanahan, and he was the acting defense secretary, and then stayed on through we had a couple of acting. So Secretary Esper, when he was the acting, Richard Spencer when he was the acting, and then stayed on as Secretary Esper's defense secretary until January of 2020 when I returned to the private sector.
So Eric, Tom, either both of you, what's it like to build ships in America in 2025?
Yeah, let me kind of paint the picture about how we got here first, because I think that's probably an important perspective, and then Tom can certainly come in and help provide his view. But if you rewind the tape back to the last time we were in a position of great power competition, right? So think about us versus Soviet Union, and the Reagan buildup in the late 80s. You know, we had U.S. industry marching towards, or sailing towards, right, a 600 ship fleet. Okay. Then the geopolitical context changed. And then in the early 90s and the 2000s, there were a series of policy decisions that had cascading effects that we're living with today, right? So, for example, right, the U.S. Navy went on a procurement holiday and stopped procurement of submarines. So effectively, we were in the Seawolf production at the time, ended Seawolf. But it wasn't just the Defense Department's procurement holiday. It was also then the trade policies that the country was pursuing, right? So you had stated policy where we effectively were deindustrializing the American economy and then promoting manufacturing growth in lower cost countries like the People's Republic of China, right? When China's ascension to the WTO in 2000. And so as a direct result of this, you saw the domestic manufacturing base that our industry that was supporting the military, not just at the prime level, but importantly, the workers in the sub-tier significantly erode. And then you saw the commensurate demand signal from the military also go down. So you effectively saw the Navy's fleet shrink to about 271 ships in 2015. Okay, so then you say, all right, those profound industrial base impacts resulted in things like 6 of the 12 major shipyards closed. When you close a shipyard, you trigger a cascading reduction in investment in supply chain, workforce, and technology modernization. The supply base shrank, right? So the supply base for submarines, for example, shrank by 80%. So 80% of the suppliers in the industry left, right? You saw about 50% of the workforce go away because there just wasn't anything for them to do. And then because the business case is gone, those that stayed in the industry weren't making capital investments to upgrade their manufacturing technologies because there wasn't a business case to do it because there wasn't a demand signal. You began to see the movie change a little bit in the later 2000s when the geopolitical environment began to change some, and like in 2008 when we did the Ford procurement. And then you saw the doubling of Virginia, or the demand signal to double the Virginia-class submarine production in 2011, and then Columbia-class SSBN production starting in 2020. And that demand signal began to help revitalize the industrial base. But then you had COVID happen in 2019, and then the impact of COVID effectively has brought us back to the point where we've got to rebuild because of the impact it's had on our workforce, most importantly, but also on our supply chain.
Yeah, the numbers that you gentlemen both have talked about are pretty harrowing in terms of the rates at which things were built. You cited a few just now, Eric, but I've got them here somewhere. But going from producing something like 4 Los Angeles class submarines a year towards the end of the Cold War. Now we're at about 1 Virginia class attack submarine a year.
Right.
In that period at the end of the Cold War, it wasn't a hot war. We were just keeping up with what we felt were the competitive demands of the Cold War. I saw a report this morning that the Chinese are building 5 Mulberry Harbor style, piers essentially, or barges, or call them what you want. Mulberries are as you gentlemen know, these are the harbors, the artificial harbors that we built in World War II to do the Normandy landing. These ships look to be pretty similar. I mean, I can't think of too many uses for these things besides an invasion scenario.
Something that's about 40 miles off their coast.
Exactly. You could have concerts on them, you could do floating homeless shelters. Yeah. But, we could have a shooting war here, at which point, and obviously your company builds very high quality products and we have an excellent Navy to operate them, but some of that stuff's going to go poof. Like the enemy will get a vote and the enemy will score some points.
Yep.
And the numbers that we're talking about are not just numbers to compete. They are theoretically the numbers, the capacity we have available to fight. And that's a concerning thought.
Yeah, I think, the shipbuilding is a long-term endeavor. When I first started earlier in my Navy career and was at Newport News Shipbuilding as a naval officer, I'd provide you some of that. We built from the keel to delivery, we built 5 aircraft carriers in 17 years. And the next 4 we're going to build are going to take 28 years. The difference was when we were in serial build on things that we knew, This is at the end of the Reagan buildup. And we had a workforce that was very mature. And I remember being at Newport News Shipbuilding and remarking how many times you would see, somebody, a father that was working there and his son was working there.
Yeah.
And it was really kind of a badge of honor in Newport News that it was a generational thing that people worked in the shipyards. And so, they were very productive. We had stable designs. We were able to churn things out pretty quickly. You mentioned, Los Angeles class submarines. And then we turned the spigot off. And the other thing that happened during that period of time that we turned the spigot off up to, the analogy of the timeline that Eric instead talked about is, the manufacturing makeup of the United States started to change. And so if you go to the shipyard today, you don't see generational, families there. It has not become like it used to be where you worked there, your father worked there, your grandfather worked there. And today it's different. So we've lost some of the manufacturing capability. Just about the same time we need to ramp back up on building the ship. So not only do we have the challenge of having to grow a more productive workforce, but manufacturing by itself is not nearly as, I don't know what to use, sexy, but it's a different country today than it was 25 years ago when blue collar workforce was really valued. And I think some of the things that we're trying to address with SAWS is to really get back to addressing that imbalance. And that imbalance is not just in shipbuilding. I mean, look at Boeing, look at Intel, look at, manufacturing giants in this country, General Electric, that have really, are struggling today for the same reasons that shipbuilding has challenges today as well.
I want to talk about solutions, but just to linger on the problem for another minute or two. What's going on here? Because if you pay attention to the policy conversation in Washington, or honestly the political conversation nationwide, people decry deindustrialization.
Yeah.
They're upset about it. They want every politician wants good manufacturing jobs back in the United States, and yet where we actually have them, there's a struggle to fill them. What is actually going on here?
So there's a lot of stuff going on. So I think maybe just to pull on the China thread a bit, because it's part of the problem here. So, we talked about what happened to U.S. shipbuilding during that period of time. Compare that with what the Chinese have done, right? So the Chinese have, as we all know, state capitalism. So the economy is driven by government-injected investments because they haven't transitioned to a consumption-driven economy yet. Okay. They come out with their 5-year plan, right? Consistently, their 5-year plan has prioritized shipbuilding, right? So their Made in China 2025 plan, which is the one they're still laboring under, prioritized commercial shipbuilding. Now, shipbuilding for the Chinese makes a lot of sense. It's an export-driven economy, right? So if they can subsidize transport ships, it helps the exports, right, to then all the other economies that are importing Chinese goods, right? So it has that knock-on effect to the other parts of their policy. 63% of Chinese shipbuilding capacity is government-owned facilities. So when you hear statistics thrown out there about how much larger Chinese shipbuilding capacity is than the rest of the world, is yes, the Chinese intentionally created that capacity. And it's gotten so large now that it has distorted global shipbuilding economics for everybody, right? So that other countries that want to have domestic shipbuilding industries, the Koreans, the Japanese most notably, because they're also export-driven economies, to stay somewhat competitive with what the Chinese have done, they have to do massive state subsidization as well. So that's what's happened with the erosion around commercial shipbuilding. When you look at commercial shipping, I'll talk about military shipbuilding in a minute, Aaron. When you talk about commercial shipbuilding, just to do as a bit of a point of comparison, right? If you were to build a transport ship in the United States, it's going to cost like 6x more than it would if you did it in, say, an Asian, like a Korean or a Japanese shipyard, right? Because the factors of production that we're working with here, and that gets to your point around what's going on more broadly. Let's just talk labor as an example of one of the inputs that we're all struggling with now. We've seen in the post-COVID economic space an over 20% increase in manufacturing wages. Okay. You see that across the board in different manufacturing ecosystems, right? Issues Boeing was having, for example, with their machinist union. As a country, we have prioritized sending folks to college through various state subsidizations for 4-year degrees, and we have underinvested in having people go to trade schools to learn a trade, right? So you think about a Pell Grant. If you wanted to go learn music at a university, the government will give you money to go learn music.
Greek philosophy,
yeah,
in that case.
Exactly.
Across the street from the Naval Academy.
Yeah, right. If
You went to St. John's.
That's right.
If you wanted to go learn to be a welder, right, you couldn't use a Pell Grant to get a 2-year associate's degree to be a welder. And so
Wild.
so companies like ours, right, have stepped into the breach, right? We have an apprentice school that was founded in 1919, right? We will go in and recruit folks. It's a degree-giving school, right? And they have multiple courses of study across 19 shipbuilding trades that are 2, 5, or 8-year courses of study, right? You can go through that program. It's a wonderful apprentice school program. They'll pay you to go to school. We'll give you a job in the shipyard. We use that because it's a significant investment for us per individual. That's what we do to sort of fast track folks to be like foremen. Separately, we maintain a relationship with 80 different trade schools across the country to try and generate, right, this trade manufacturing interest at 2-year degree schools where we can bring folks in. But at the end of the day, there is a significant manufacturing workforce shortage in this country. And until you get that equation fixed, you're not going to be able to reindustrialize. Now, there's ways to limit the amount of manufacturing workforce you need through automation and other things. But at the end of the day, you need the workforce.
And in other words, it's not just flipping the switch. Like
It's not just
Congress
flipping
and
the
the
switch.
Navy and everyone can kind of get on board today and say, here are the resources, go build, and you would struggle.
Well, just for
Exactly.
some of these more exquisite, think about like the work at Newport News, right? With nuclear shipbuilding, to be a nuclear welder, right? It's going to take 8 years of training.
Yeah.
So to your point around flipping the switch, I may be able to flip the switch and get someone into a program so they can start to learn what it's like to be a nuclear welder, but that proficiency is going to have to be accumulated over years.
I mean, this is a sort of a in the weeds nerdy question, and maybe nobody here is qualified to answer it. I'm the furthest from it. You may be the closest to it with your Rickover interview, but what takes 8 years? I mean, what are you learning as a nuclear welder?
Well, I mean, the specs and the precise nature of what you got to do to meet the welding specs we have in the nuclear world, it's an art, and it's just there's a proficiency issue here, just like playing the piano. It takes you a while to get really, really good at it, and to be able to do it solo without a bunch of supervision on top of it. So what we're finding today is, you go hire somebody, you can go give them training at the apprentice school, but it'll take them 5 years or so to get to the point where they're proficient enough that they could go off and do something that's really critically important from a reactor safety standpoint on their own. And so we'll start using them immediately, but there's an overhead cost associated with it because you're going to provide more supervision. And so, as we ramp back up, there's an element that's going to tell you that, look, initially there's actually your productivity levels were probably going to go down a little bit, but that's the price you're going to have to pay, green labor, as we call it, in order to reestablish that proficiency. And the problem with the way we have ordered chips over the last 25 years is, industry has responded rationally. If you have a demand down, if the demand signal drops, it only takes you 1 to 3 years to downsize the workforce. And then once you've lost them, and it'll probably take 5 to 7 years to recreate that workforce. And so, to your analogy on flip the light switch, when people said, "Hey, we all of a sudden need more ships," wasn't that simple. You couldn't say overnight, "Hey, I need you to build 4.9 submarines a year like you did in the 90s when you had this mature, very productive workforce." And that's some of what we're struggling with today. And then you add on top of that the fact that, where does that workforce exist? A lot of people like to talk about Arthur Hearn's book, about the industrialization during World War II, Freedom's Forge, as if, all we have to do is recreate that. But if you read the book, you'll notice that, by the way, that wasn't a light switch either. It took him several years till we really ramped up. And by that time, the war was almost over. But we also did that during a period coming out of the Depression where there was plentiful workforce that people wanted to work, and we had a massive amount of investment. So it's different today than it was, back in the 40s. And the other thing is, we don't have the luxury if we were to get into a fight with China of having all of our allies do the fighting while we ramp up the industrial base. We're going to fight with what we have today. And so I think we're at it today, but until it's going to take us 5 to 7 years to really get to the point where we can start cranking these things out at a productive level and start massively change the size of the force from the 290 to 300 we're at today to the 381 that the Navy would like to be at tomorrow. And the other point along that side is everybody says, "Hey, we got to 600 ships during the Reagan buildup." Yeah, but we started at 490. So we only had to go 100 ships, and we had stable designs with a productive mature workforce. We have to go about the same number of ships today, but we're starting from a deficit in terms of where we are from a manufacturing standpoint.
It's a harrowing historical reflection that occurred to me as I was thinking about our conversation today was, with the industrial base that our country had in the early 1940s, which was pretty robust, all the cars we were building, just across the board. After the disaster at Pearl Harbor, it took the Navy, about 2 years, really, before it was able to properly go on offense. I mean, we were down in the Solomons and operating down there, but, to really make that cut across the Central Pacific and take the fight to the Japanese, that's the end of 43 into 44. So 2 years, and that's with that industrial base.
And people forget that, the ships that we were building back then, they didn't have air conditioning. Sailors were sleeping in hammocks. The combat systems were not nearly as, we didn't have networks, we didn't have fiber optic cables. And a lot of people would like to talk about, hey, we took Yorktown in 45 days, sent her back out to sea, and she was sunk later. So, I don't think the ships that we build today are a lot more complex, a lot more battle hardened, to take a look. And so it's not the same type of shipbuilding that we had back in World War II. It's the other thing. And the ships, we were probably a lot more willing to take losses back in World War II than we would be today. I mean, if you listen to the wargaming, people say, well, geez, I got into a war game with China, and we eliminated a lot of the ships, but I lost 2 carriers. Oh my God, I can't afford to lose 2 aircraft carriers. I spent $14 billion for them. Like, okay, if you're going to get in a fight with China, you better recognize you're probably going to lose some ships, but, is the nation willing to go have that discussion?
Yeah. Yeah. And this has a procurement dimension to it as well, of course. I think we're all familiar with Elon Musk's comments about the F-35. There's an analogical, you can apply that reasoning to the maritime space in the same way and ask, whatever your conclusion is, ask, what is the value of these very high-end platforms? And maybe there's 2 ways I'd like to go from here, and we can do it in either order. I want to keep talking about the workforce and the solutions there in the SAWS plan you guys mentioned. But I do want to talk about this idea of what role does mass production of things that are less exquisite, whether they're unmanned or maybe, just more or less good stuff, but we need it. It's got the core stuff that you need, but nothing else. So Eric, Tom, how are we?
So why don't we talk a little bit about the solution? So, because I do think there is a story of redemption here, and then we can talk a bit about how we think about force structure kind of going forward, because you may not be aware, but we are also the largest producer of UUVs globally. So in addition to producing high-end capabilities like aircraft carriers and submarines, we're also the largest producer of autonomous uncrewed vehicles. So we've got, I think, a unique perspective both on kind of how they can play an important role, but then also the integration of the manned-unmanned teaming capability in, say, an undersea environment, and what that could look like going forward. So, so maybe just on that kind of how do we put out of here to a place where we're executing at a rate the country needs us to. As we think about it, there's really five areas we've got to focus on. The first is growing and retaining that world-class workforce, and the biggest piece of that problem for us right now is wages. So when you think about kind of the economics of shipbuilding are driven by a handful of very large multi-year contracts. The vast majority of contracts that we're currently operating under, and this would be true for other U.S. shipbuilders, were all established pre-COVID. That means all the contract economics were established pre-COVID. These are firm fixed price incentive contracts, right? So they do not have the protections in place that you'd expect for, what we saw from the pandemic, which was the shock around, 20% plus labor increases. And so as a result, we need innovative contracting methodologies to kind of get us out of this problem so we can give that workforce a wage and stem some of the double-digit attrition that we're seeing in the shipyards, because, a machinist or a welder is a highly fungible skill set that if they're not doing it for ships, they can do it for a variety of other manufacturing things, right? And so we find this position where we're training the workforce and that workforce will leave. And what we need to be able to do is provide wage increases to help support that. Tom mentioned SAWS. I'll just touch on it now briefly, if that's all right, Aaron. So, there was an initiative that we had worked with the Navy called the Shipbuilder Accountability and Workforce Support Initiative, which was an innovative approach to contracting for service and support costs. So the way it works now, when the Navy does a block buy, let's say on submarines, they'll appropriate money for submarines that you're currently not building. What SAWS would enable us to do is access some of those funds as relates to service and support costs and pull that forward to make increases in capital investments to improve productivity and do wage increases to keep the workforce working. And then that would enable productivity gains throughout the block, right? So you'd make up for the investment associated with that. We think that's an important element of getting us to the build rates that we need to be competitive with China. The other things that we need to focus on, right? Investment in new technologies drive deck plate performance. One of the big differences than sort of the Freedom Forge era was this advent of Industry 4.0 technologies, right? Additive manufacturing, digital design tools. You've seen radical adaptation to these technologies in, say, the automotive industry or commercial aerospace. Shipbuilding is further behind in adaptation of those technologies. So what are we doing to drive those technologies to drive deck plate efficiencies? The third thing we're focused on is modernization of infrastructure and expansion of capacity. Right? So in some areas, there are the need for additional capacity. What are we doing to expand capacity and then modernize that infrastructure? You go to the Newport News shipyard, for example, was built in 1883. It's laid out like a Victorian shipyard. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? The big castings house we have there actually predates the shipyard, right? That's still being used for one-of-a-kind castings that you can't do anywhere else in America. So being able to modernize and invest to modernize the infrastructure. The two final pieces are rebuilding the supply chain. So I talked about the consolidation of the supply chain that occurred because of the drawdown that happened as part of the Last Supper. It's to the point now where when you think about our material spend on sequence critical items, so things that if they don't show up in sequence will delay the construction of a ship, 70% of our material spend on items like that are to only one supplier, because there's only one supplier left who can meet that spec, right? So systematically we need to go through, and this is something that the 13806 report talked about, to then expand industrial capacity in that tier 2, tier 3 of the supply chain to help increase throughput, because that's where we had bottlenecks and those were disrupted during COVID. And then the final piece to this is how do we think about integration of the allied industrial base? AUKUS has gotten a lot of attention. I think AUKUS plays an important role as we think about integration of the submarine industrial base across the United States and the United Kingdom. But there are other places, in Australia, of course, but there are other places where we can work with allies and partners to help expand.
Well, can we let's stick with, I want to get to the unmanned stuff and that area, but can we stick with this for a second, the allies side of things? I mean, it's striking that China's the world's biggest shipbuilder, but then they're followed by the Japanese and the Koreans, right? Which is sort of embarrassing sitting here in the United States of America. These great countries, big economies, close allies, but smaller countries than the United States by a pretty significant margin. And yet there they are building significant numbers of ships. President Biden's ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, has been pretty outspoken in his views about co-production and things like that. Like, what does all this look like from your point of view in terms of allied capacity and partnership?
Maybe let me touch on the commercial dimensions of that, and then Tom could probably talk about the military specific stuff. So, as I talked about earlier, it comes back to industrial policy, right? The Japanese and the Koreans, as export-driven economies, had significant state subsidization of their shipyards commercially because, again, as an export-driven economy, it made sense for them to subsidize the cost of the things that physically moved the goods from Japan or Korea to the United States or European markets. So they maintain commercial subsidization of commercial shipbuilding applications, right? Tom can speak at great lengths the difference between building sort of a commercial transport ship versus a destroyer, right? And the approach is taken very generally about how that's done. The other thing to kind of focus on in this conversation is requirements for military shipbuilding as opposed to commercial shipbuilding, right? Because investments that the Japanese and the Korean governments have made in their commercial shipyards wouldn't necessarily translate to certain military applications.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two dimensions to it. I mean, I've been paying pretty close attention to what Ambassador Emanuel was talking about. First was talking about, hey, we could do more maintenance over in Japan, and doing maintenance over there would relieve, our shipyards and allow us to build more submarines. So he's kind of mixing apples and oranges. He's talking about repairing non-nuclear powered surface ships. We would do a lot of that in the ship repair facility in Yokosuka. We have the capacity here in the United States to do surface ship repair, but taking work over there would not relieve the two problems we have today, which is building enough new construction submarines, and then maintaining the ones that we have. And you've probably seen reports that up to 40% of our current attack submarines are in maintenance at any one time. So we only use 60% of the fleet. So I think we got to look carefully at anything that would improve our capacity in the short term. But I think it's an oversimplistic view of how you would fix the problem. The other part is, commercial shipbuilding is completely different from military shipbuilding. I've watched pretty closely the Ships for America Act that Representative Walz, who's going to be the next security advisor, has put out in conjunction with the senator from Arizona. And I think there's merit in us improving our commercial shipbuilding. From a policy perspective, there's things that we probably have to go look at, but Eric has alluded to most of it. The reason that we don't build commercial ships in this country, despite, even if you set aside if we had the workforce, is because the cost is 6x. And so nobody wants to build commercial tankers here. In fact, the last time we tried to build commercial tankers in the early 2000s at Newport News Shipbuilding, we did it at a significant loss. So there's not a business case to build commercial shipbuilding. And some of, I think, what we're doing in the Ships for America Act would do that. On the military side of the house, we build these ships to be pretty robust for a reason. And I can give you a laundry list of ships from Cole to Princeton to McCain to Fitzgerald to San Francisco to Connecticut submarines, surface ships that in the last 20 years, you've either taken a hit in a military environment through a mine or they've run into, in the 2 submarine cases, run into undersea mounts or had collisions most recently with Fitzgerald and McCain. And in each and every one of those cases, ships were able to make it back into port. And I can tell you, from being the commander of the Naval Sea Systems Command, the way we build and design these ships is done for a very specific reason, and it's to make sure they can get back to port if they were to get, in battle damage. And I don't mean to disparage any of the other shipbuilders around the world, but they don't build ships to the same specifications that we do. And we do that for a good reason. And I don't think we would want to, relax those design specifications. When we get into the unmanned world, which I know you wanted to get into next, that's a completely different era. And you can build things that are attritable, can throw them away. And I think that's a perfectly good way to go reduce some of the requirements and get us the numbers we want. But in terms of the ships, military warships we build today, we build them that way for a reason. And I can only imagine, if we were to get into a fight after relaxing the specs and we were to lose a bunch of sailors or lose a ship, the recriminations would be pretty loud.
Yeah. I think we're all going to have to get ready for that. I saw Admiral Paparo make some comments 6 weeks ago, maybe, something like that. It was really harrowing. Talked about it on the show here before. Someone was asking him at a public event, about the Replicator Initiative and are these solutions that are applicable in the Strait. And I will paraphrase his response as being something along the lines of, yeah, it's all great, fine. I'm for drones. It's great. But I have to get the stuff from here, the United States, to there, the Western Pacific. And this replicator thing, my words, not his, but his meaning, it doesn't do anything for me on that front. You're not thinking about the whole problem. You're thinking about the tactical application in the last 100 meters, as it were. Right. And so it's hard to imagine scenarios when you're thinking about the whole problem where we simply go unmanned, where there isn't a role for larger platforms. I think that's true. Like, that's an opinion that I have. Can you
I can give you a good example.
Yeah.
So when you think about the HI portfolio broadly, right? So obviously, I'll pick 2 of our divisions. So Newport News, which would be responsible for part of our Virginia-class submarine fleet. And then we have a mission technologies business. That mission technologies business is the largest producer of UUVs globally. So what we've created is a solution called Yellow Moray, which is with the fleet today, which is our ability to do a torpedo tube launch and recovery of an unmanned system off of a Virginia-class submarine. So when you think about that kind of capability, right, you're beginning to address sort of the warfighting challenges that Admiral Paparo indicated, right, which is how do I take a capability that can get to the fight, but then I get the benefit of that manned-unmanned teaming when I can then launch a very capable UUV platform that has significant range to it, go do things that I may not want the submarine to do, expose itself to things that I may not want the submarine to expose itself to, and then get recovered back by the submarine, right? If you liken that a bit to, say, like a collaborative combat aircraft relationship between, say, an F-35 and a CCA, like that capability won't be with the Air Force till 2030, right? We've got that capability undersea today.
What does this all look like in, I'll pick a number here, 20 years? Like, what is the technological balance between manned and unmanned at sea look like? What are the future operating concepts that you think about?
Well, if you look at the Navy's most recent shipbuilding plan, it's about 25% unmanned and about 75% manned. So they're calling for a battle force of 381 ships and about 134, a mix of 134 unmanned. Undoubtedly, unmanned is going to play a key role going forward. Some of what Admiral Paparo talked about is spot on, but we're not going to get to the point where unmanned is going to completely replace what we do in the military. It can take some missions away from us. For instance, today, we have to use Super Hornets to tank to get the more extended range on our planes. So we take fighter jets and we put tanks on them and we send them out and they act as a tanker. Now you can envision an unmanned tanker just loitering out there that any plane could go onto, and I think you're going to see that happen. So I think if you look at where we are today, unmanned aerials are pretty mature. You can see where we're using it in the Middle East. You can see where we could use that fighting. Unmanned undersea, as Eric alluded to, is pretty mature. We already are using it on missions. You may have seen an article today that talked about the USS Michigan, one of our SSGNs, that had notably used some unmanned technology to do some pretty interesting stuff in some parts of the world. And we're going to go expand that out even more. Unmanned surface is kind of the weak link right now, where the Navy has struggled with figuring out what the concept of operations and has really not decided, what do we want this to be? Do we want it to be a really large ship, 10,000 tons that carries a bunch of missiles, or do we want it to be a super small ship? You've got to get to the fight. It's a long way to go. Are we comfortable with putting munitions on an unmanned vessel that somebody could then come attack? Are we comfortable with unmanned platforms using AI, deciding when to shoot munitions? I think those are all elements of the fight that we're working our way through today that, Admiral Powers probably alluded to.
Another question that's as much to do with operating concepts as with manufacturing, though it's about operating concepts at import, so relevant to your guys' day-to-day. We've seen the Ukrainians who, I don't know the numbers, I couldn't give you an overview of their order of battle at the start of the war, but we've seen them do a lot of damage to the Russian Navy without much of a navy of their own to speak of, which is really interesting. And a lot of the hits they've sort of been with Russian ships by the pier. And I expect if we went back to, the 1940s here in the United States, and you went to if you went to San Diego, you went to the port of San Diego, you would have seen security, nets, watches, patrols, you would have seen some pretty intense port security. The Chinese pretty clearly have in mind broad operating concepts, strategic concepts, maybe if the balloon goes up in the Western Pacific that affect the American homeland. They have that as an option. How do you guys think about securing stuff in port, securing what you're manufacturing? Obviously don't divulge anything. Anyone can listen to this podcast, so don't divulge anything you shouldn't, but as an issue, are we taking that, not HI, I won't put you in a position of asking you, is HI taking it seriously? Is America taking that issue seriously? Because it seems to me like a lot of the scenarios that could come in the Pacific involve things happening in the United States, and not just on the West Coast, on the East Coast too.
Well, force protection is always, a key element. And, unfortunately in the world that we live in, you've got to, if you get it right every day, you get a C. And if you have one hiccup, you get a ship sunk. So I think it's an evolving element. I think the Navy is focused on it in the right ways. But with the advent of unmanned technology and a lot of the other things that's going on, it is going to continue to be a challenge for us going forward, and something that we're going to have to continue to focus on.
Yeah, I think I'd just say it's public. There was the public case where there was a Chinese student who was flying a drone outside of our shipyard, and that obviously the FBI was involved in prosecution of that as a potential espionage case. We're mindful of the issue, right? And then we're taking, as Tom said, in coordination with our Navy customers, all the protective measures I think are necessary for that. I think you raise a good point, Aaron, that says this is all part of, I think, the mindset that we're evolving to going forward as we're facing great power competition, and it's as mindful here as it is overseas.
And it's interesting, you can extend this out to a lot of areas. You've seen recently a couple of, the Chinese had a commercial ship dragging an anchor up in the North Atlantic to damage the SOSUS cables. And so, some of what we're doing with unmanned vehicles today is to build unmanned vehicles that can actually, go very deep and can look at cables and make sure that they're intact, and then make sure that people aren't tapping into them in ways that they shouldn't be tapped into. So that's another area where I think on the unmanned side of the house, it's going to be a capability that we really need.
It's just something that's very much on my mind, and I want to be respectful of your gentleman's time. So this comment can be, in effect, my last question. So respond however you see fit. But the taboos about great power confrontation seem to me to be weakening substantially, and what 10 or 20 years ago would have seemed shocking to contemplate. One nuclear power attacking targets on another nuclear power's homeland. It's like, well, that's probably no one's going to try that because of the obvious possibility of escalation. In 2025, I'm just not so sure I'm as confident in the strength of that taboo. And it strikes me that there are things that the Chinese, for example, could attempt in our shipyards, whether through cyber or whether through means that may not generate that many casualties, but would generate a lot of problems for us and our operating concepts, that would likely or could very well occur in the first few hours. And again, not just in the West Coast. I mean, there's no reason you couldn't try it in the Atlantic as well. If your tools are cyber, your tools are cheap unmanned stuff, whatever. And the world feels a lot more dangerous in 2025 than it did in 2015.
Well, I think in the spectrum of warfare, from soft kill, cyber, some of the things all the way up to hard kill, if you rewind the tape 20, 30 years ago to the Cold War, everything was focused on the hard kill side of the house, backfire bombers, aircraft carriers, et cetera. And I think, today, the primary focus is on the soft kill side of the house, because some of it you can do anonymously.
Yeah.
And I think the Chinese and the Soviets would prefer, where we're going to dominate is on the hard kill side of the house. Our weapons are better, our people are better, and so they really don't want to get into a hard kill fight with us. I think that's where we're at a significant advantage. On the other hand, the side of the house, the soft kill, and they put a lot of time and effort into that, I think, is where you're going to see, both sides was focusing today where there are some vulnerabilities, and there's a little bit of anonymity that goes along with it too that would prevent you from, potentially getting yourself in big, trouble for doing something to another country.
Yeah, I think the subtext of the question, and really the point, Aaron, I think is a good one, which is, listen, whether it's in the context of the great power competition, it's lessons learned from what we're seeing in Ukraine or lessons learned from what we're seeing with the Israeli actions in the Middle East, like the defense industrial base is a critical component of our ability to project power and deliver advantage to the warfighter. And so we're very focused on our role in execution and delivering ships for the Navy so they can be successful in what they need to do to keep us all safe.
Yeah, I think we should take great care to make sure that in the Pacific we are the Israelis and not Hezbollah in terms of what happens.
Is
next.
that a beeper on your waist?
Was it from the beeper to the knee? Let it on, we'll be free. Okay, that's what I enjoy. There are so many good ones. There was a cartoon of Hassan. This is before Nasrallah was killed. There was a cartoon of a Nasrallah-looking person in his bathroom staring at his electric tube, like warily. It was good.
But that would also gets to the point earlier about the need to understand the provenance of microelectronics in our supply chain and subtier, right? So,
Eric Chewning, Tom Moore of HII, really interesting conversation. Thank you to both of you gentlemen. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
This is a Nebulous Media production. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.